The wind out here doesn't just make you cold, it hates you. It screams across the ice sheets like a dying god, looking for any gap in your thermal layers to insert its icy fingers and stop your heart. I adjusted the strap of my rifle, feeling the familiar weight of the cold steel against my chest. My breath was freezing against the inside of my respirator, turning into a gritty frost that tasted like recycled rubber in fear. But the cold wasn't what had my heart hammering against my ribs. It was the smell. Even out here, amidst the pristine, sterile white of the Arctic Circle, I could smell it. Ozone. That sharp, metallic scent of high-voltage electricity and fried circuits, cutting through the clean air like a knife. And underneath that? The smell of rot. Sweet, cloying, ancient rot. I crested the ridge, my boots crunching loudly on the packed snow, a sound that felt like a gunshot in the silence. There it was. The facility wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't on any map, definitely not on the old NATO charts I salvaged from the bunker in Idaho. But the coordinates from the dying man's radio didn't lie. A massive concrete maw jutted out of the side of the glacier, the blast doors slightly ajar, darkness spilling out of them like ink. I checked my Geiger counter. Green. Whatever killed the people inside wasn't radiation. I approached the entrance, sliding my hand over the rough concrete. It was pitted, scarred by what looked like heavy caliber fire. Something had tried to get in. Or something had tried to get out. I clicked on my tactical light, the beam slicing through the gloom, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. I stepped inside. The transition was instant. The wind died, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. It was warmer in here, the air thick and still. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I moved forward, weapon raised, practicing the heel-to-toe walk I'd perfected over 3 years of surviving the collapse. Silence is survival. Noise is death. The corridor was wide enough to drive a truck through, lined with conduits and pipes that hummed with a faint, dying energy. Emergency lights flickered in a rhythmic, hypnotic orange pulse. They cast long, shifting shadows that looked too much like grasping hands. I passed the guard station. The glass was shattered, blowing outward. Inside, a skeleton sat slumped in a chair, a sidearm still clutched in bony fingers. The uniform was shredded, but the patch on the shoulder was still visible, a black globe with a lightning bolt. Project Borealis. I'd heard the rumors in the settlement camps. Whispers of a weaponized virus, of super soldiers, of the mistake that ended the world. I thought they were just campfire stories to scare the rookies. I was wrong. I pushed deeper. The smell of ozone grew stronger, mixing with the copper tang of old blood. The walls here were smeared with dried black ichor. Drag marks. Something heavy had been pulled down this hall. I reached a heavy bulkhead door, labeled Sector 4, Biological Containment. The wheel was spun open. I squeezed through the gap, my tactical vest scraping against the metal. The sound echoed, a sharp scratch that seemed to travel for miles. I froze. Waiting. Listening. Then I heard it. A shuffle. The sound of bare skin sliding on linoleum. Wet. Heavy. Uneven. It was coming from the darkness ahead. I raised my rifle, thumbing the safety off. The click was tiny, but in that tomb, it sounded like a thunderclap. The shuffling stopped. A low, gurgling sound emanated from the shadows, like someone trying to breathe through a throat full of fluid. "Hello?" I whispered, against my better judgment. A silhouette detached itself from the gloom. It was human, or it had been. It wore a tattered lab coat, now stained a gruesome brown. One arm hung uselessly at its side, the bone visible. But it was the face that froze my blood. The jaw was unhinged, hanging loose, and the eyes. The eyes were glowing with a faint, bioluminescent blue. The same color as the chemical spills I'd seen in the wasteland. It took a step forward, then another, moving with a jerky, unnatural speed. It wasn't a mindless shambler. It was hunting. I squeezed the trigger. The silence shot puffed, and the creature's head snapped back, black mist spraying the wall. It dropped. But before the casing even hit the floor, another sound started. A chorus. From the vents. From the floor tiles. From the darkness behind the other doors. Screeches. Gurgles. The sound of hundreds of wet feet slapping against the tile. I hadn't found a research lab. I had found a hive. And I had just rung the dinner bell. I turned to the side passage, sprinting now, stealth abandoned. My boots slammed on the metal grating. I needed high ground. I needed a choke point. I burst into a server room, rows of blinking towers towering over me. I scanned the room. There. A ladder leading to a maintenance catwalk. I scrambled up, my gloves slipping on the cold rungs, just as the door I came through burst open. They poured in. Not just scientists. Soldiers in tactical gear, their armor fused to their flesh, their movements coordinated. They looked up at me, a sea of glowing blue eyes. I pulled a frag grenade from my vest, pulled the pin, and dropped it. The explosion rocked the walkway, sending shrapnel and heat washing over me. I didn't wait to see the damage. I ran along the catwalk, the metal vibrating under my feet. The facility was massive, a labyrinth of horrors beneath the ice. I had to find the central control. I had to know what they did here. And more importantly, I had to know if there was a way out that didn't involve becoming lunch. I reached a heavy door at the end of the catwalk, slammed my shoulder into it, and tumbled into a control room. A massive window overlooked a cavernous hangar below. I scrambled to my feet and looked down. My breath caught in my throat. Below, suspended in massive cryotanks, were thousands of them. An army. Waiting. And on the central console in front of me, a single terminal screen was blinking green text, thaw cycle complete. Released in T-10 minutes. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The apocalypse wasn't over. It was just waking up. The airlock hissed, a mechanical gasp that sounded agonizingly loud against the backdrop of the eternal Arctic wind. As the heavy blast door ground shut behind me, sealing out the blinding white chaos of the tundra, the silence of the facility pressed in. It wasn't the empty silence of a vacuum. It was a pressurized, waiting silence. Heavy with the dust of 20 years and the lingering smell of ozone and stale recycled air. My Geiger counter clicked rhythmically on my belt, a slow, steady heartbeat that offered zero comfort. I adjusted the straps of my pack, the nylon stiff with frost, and switched my headlamp to the red filter. Bright light draws attention, and in a place like this, a darker blot on the map of the world, attention was the last thing I wanted. I was standing in the decontamination antechamber of Sector 4, a black site research lab buried beneath the ice shelf. Rumors of which had been the only thing keeping me moving north while the rest of the world burned south. My boots crunched on the grate floor as I moved toward the inner security checkpoint. The cold here was different. Outside, it was a physical assault, a biting wind that sought to freeze the fluid in your eyes. Inside, it was a stillness that seeped into the marrow. I swept the beam across the security station. 3 bodies. They were mummified by the dry, sub-zero air, their skin pulled tight over bone like parchment paper. They weren't turned. No bite marks. They had died at their posts, MP5s still strapped to their chests, likely from the hypoxia when the ventilation systems failed 2 decades ago. I knelt beside the first corpse, my fingers clumsy in thick gloves. Scavenging is an art form of the desperate. You don't look for what you want, you look for what keeps you alive another hour. I stripped the magazines from their vests. The springs were stiff, but the 9mm rounds were clean, hermetically sealed against the rot of the world. I found a half-eaten roll of peppermint candies in a pocket, the wrapper brittle. I took that too. Sugar is energy. Energy is life. I bypassed the mag locks on the door with a localized EMP charge I jury-rigged from a microwave capacitor back in Anchorage. The spark was blinding, and the lock disengaged with a defeated clunk. I pushed through into the primary corridor. This is where the story of the infection changed. We all knew the basics: bite, fever, death, reanimation. The shamblers down south were biomass, rotting engines of hunger that fell apart in the summer heat or froze solid in the winter. But the rumors said the virus here, the progenitor strain, was different. Adaptable. As I walked down the hallway, panning my light over the walls, I saw the proof. The frost on the walls wasn't ice. It was a lattice of white, fibrous tendrils, like a fungal root system, pulsing faintly with a bioluminescent blue rhythm. It wasn't just surviving the cold, it was feeding on the thermal energy of the facility's dying reactor. I reached the medical wing, the double doors hanging off their hinges. Inside, the scavenging potential was a gold mine. I swept the shelves, dumping expired antibiotics onto the floor, useless poison now, and hunting for the stabilizers. Epinephrine, morphine, antiseptic gauze. I found a cache of sealed trauma kits in a locked cabinet. I smashed the glass with the butt of my rifle, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I paused, holding my breath. Nothing but the hum of the facility. I shoveled the kits into my bag. Then I saw the data pads on the nurse's station. I wiped the dust off one and hit the power. Miraculously, the battery had a sliver of charge, preserved by the cold storage conditions. The screen flickered to life. Subject 89, the log read. Metabolic rate increased by 400%. Subject is generating internal heat. Epidermal layer calcifying. The pathogen is reacting to the environmental stressors by armoring the host. I looked up from the screen and froze. At the end of the ward, near the operating theater, stood a containment tube. The glass was shattered from the inside out. Shards of reinforced plexiglass littered the floor. Whatever had been inside hadn't rotted. It had evolved. I raised my rifle, clicking the safety off. The silence was broken by a wet, shifting sound from the ceiling vents. I looked up. The white fibrous mold wasn't just on the walls. It was dripping from the vents, forming a sticky, web-like curtain. And hanging in the center of the web, clinging to the ceiling like a spider made of human parts, was one of them. It didn't look like the zombies I knew. Its skin was pale white, hard and segmented like the shell of a crab. Its eyes were gone, covered by a smooth plate of bone. It didn't need to see, the fungal network on the walls was its nervous system. It felt the vibration of my boots. It sensed the heat of my blood. It dropped. The creature hit the floor with a heavy, metallic thud and uncoiled instantly. It was fast, impossibly fast. I fired. The suppressed shot sparked off its chest plate, the rounds unable to penetrate the calcified armor. It shrieked, a sound that wasn't a vocal cord vibration but a grinding of tectonic plates. It lunged. I dove over a gurney, the creature's claws tearing through the metal frame where my head had been a second ago. I scrambled back, my boots slipping on the slick, mold-covered tiles. I needed a weak point. The joints. The neck. It turned toward me, the head tilting with twitchy, insectoid movements. I aimed for the soft tissue under the arm as it raised a claw to strike. I squeezed the trigger, dumping half the magazine. Black blood sprayed, steaming as it hit the freezing air. The creature roared, faltering, its limb hanging uselessly. But it didn't stop. It rammed me, the impact feeling like being hit by a car. I flew backward, crashing into a supply shelf, glass vials raining down on me. Pain flared in my ribs, sharp and hot. I gasped, struggling to inhale. The thing was on top of me in a second, pinning me down. Its breath smelled of ammonia and copper. Up close, I saw the horror of its evolution. The teeth were rows of serrated bone, fused into a beak. It snapped at my face, and I jammed the barrel of my rifle into its open maw. It bit down, the metal screeching. I pulled the trigger. The back of its head blew out in a spray of blue-gray matter. The pressure released instantly, the body going limp and heavy on top of me. I shoved it off, gasping, adrenaline flooding my system so hard my hands shook uncontrollably. I checked myself. Bruised ribs, maybe cracked. No bites. The parka had taken the shredding from its claws. I stood up, swaying. I looked at the corpse. The white fungus on the floor was already moving toward it, tendrils reaching out to reclaim the biomass. This wasn't just a research lab, it was a hive. The virus had created an ecosystem. I reloaded, my fingers fumbling with the magazine. I needed to get to the lower levels. The datapad mentioned a Project Zero in the sub-basement, a synthesizer capable of creating a localized antigen. If the infection had evolved this much, the cure had to be down there too, or at least the blueprint for one. I moved out of the medical wing, leaving the twitching corpse to the mold. The corridor to the freight elevator was darker, the emergency lights having failed completely here. I relied on the narrow cone of my red light. As I walked, I noticed the shadows stretching. Not normal shadows. The silhouettes of people fused into the walls, absorbed by the white growth. They were the staff, the soldiers, the scientists. They hadn't just died, they had become part of the structure. I saw a hand protruding from the fungus, clutching a keycard. I recognized the clearance level, Directorate. I hesitated. Touching the biomass was risky. I pulled a pair of forceps from my medkit and carefully pried the card from the dead, fungal fingers. The wall shuddered. A low-frequency hum vibrated through the floor. The hive knew I was stealing from it. I reached the elevator shaft. The car was stuck 3 floors down, but the cables looked intact. I holstered my rifle and grabbed the rappel line I kept for urban ruins. This was going to be a long descent. As I hooked in and swung out over the abyss of the shaft, I looked down. Far below, in the pitch black of the sub-basement, thousands of bioluminescent blue dots looked back up at me. They weren't lights. They were eyes. And they were blinking in unison. I gripped the rope, took a breath of the stale, recycled air, and began to lower myself into the nest. The hydraulic seal screamed, a piercing shriek of metal shearing against metal that had been kissed by frost for a decade. I held my breath, the condensation freezing instantly in the hood of my parka, waiting for the echo to die. In the silence of the Arctic, a sound like that was a dinner bell, I waited 1 minute. 2. Nothing but the howling wind outside, battering the reinforced concrete of the entrance bunker. I slipped through the gap, the air inside stale, smelling of ozone, ancient sweat, and something copper-sharp. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom, dancing over dust motes that hung suspended in the freezing air. This wasn't just a shelter. This was Facility 9, the needle in the haystack of the northern wastes. My boots crunched on the grate floor. The first priority was security, the second was scavenging. My Geiger counter clicked rhythmically, a slow heartbeat that told me the reactor was likely offline but not leaking. I moved methodically, sweeping the corners. The entry vestibule was littered with the refuse of a panicked evacuation. Overturned tables, scattered papers frozen to the floor, and the bodies. They were preserved perfectly by the sub-zero temperatures, statues of despair huddled against the blast doors. I knelt by a soldier, his face a mask of blue-gray ice. I wasn't looking for his identity. I was looking for his magazine. I pried the rifle from his stiff, frozen fingers, the plastic polymer brittle to the touch. It was a standard-issue carbine, the action frozen shut. I'd have to strip it, clean it, and warm it before it was useless, but the ammunition was gold. I stripped his rig, taking 3 mags, a combat knife, and a sealed pouch of medical supplies. I pushed deeper, past the airlock and into the main corridor. The facility was designed like a hive, descending into the permafrost. The deeper I went, the colder it got, a paradox of subterranean insulation failing against the encroaching ice. I found the cafeteria on level 2. It was a tomb. Trays were still on the tables, meals interrupted. I scanned the shelves in the back, and Marie's freeze-dried fruit, water rations. I stuffed my pack until the seams groaned. It was enough calories to last me a month, maybe 2 if I rationed. But food wasn't why I risked the traverse across the ice shelf. I needed answers. I needed to know why the radio signals from this place had changed from distress calls to a rhythmic, guttural static before cutting out entirely 5 years ago. Level 4 was bioresearch. The blast doors here were thicker, scored with claw marks that dug inches into the hardened steel. The metal had been peeled back in places, like the lid of a tin can. I unholstered my sidearm, the weight of it reassuring despite the trembling in my hands. The air here was different. It didn't smell like stale air anymore. It smelled like chemical pine and rot. I stepped into a lab, the glass observation windows shattered. On a central terminal, the emergency power flickered, a dying amber LED pulsing in the dark. I bypassed the lock. Someone had left the admin console logged in. The last entry was dated 3 weeks after the global outbreak. I scrolled through the logs, my eyes widening. They hadn't just been studying the Solanum virus here. They had been weaponizing it for cold weather warfare. The entries described strain Zeta. The standard virus slowed in the cold, the reanimated bodies freezing solid and becoming immobile. The military wanted soldiers who could fight in the Russian winter, in the Antarctic wastes. They forced the virus to evolve. I read the pathology report. Strain Zeta didn't coagulate. It replaced the host's blood with a biological antifreeze, a viscous black ichor that prevented freezing down to -60 degrees. It hyperaccelerated the nervous system to compensate for the thermal drop. These weren't the shamblers I was used to. The logs spoke of twitch reflexes, pack coordination, and thermal vision. My breath hitched. I wasn't alone in a tomb of frozen zombies. I was in a hive of dormant predators. A sound from the corridor made my blood turn to slush. It wasn't a moan. It was a clicking sound, like ice cracking under pressure. Click. Click. Hiss. I killed the flashlight instantly, plunging the lab into suffocating darkness, save for the weak amber pulse of the terminal. I crouched behind the desk, listening. The footsteps were light, rapid, tip-tap tip-tap. Not the drag of a rotting foot. This was something hunting. I peeked over the laminate edge. In the hallway, illuminated by the faint emergency strip lighting, a silhouette moved. It was humanoid, but wrong. The posture was hunched, the spine distended. It wore the tattered remnants of a lab coat, hanging off a frame that looked skeletal yet corded with dense muscle. It paused, turning its head. Where the eyes should have been, there was only a milky white film, but the veins pulsing around its temples were black and thick, standing out against the pale skin like a road map of infection. It opened its mouth, and a cloud of steam hissed out, smelling of ammonia. It wasn't breathing, it was venting heat. I realized then that scavenging was over. Survival was the only objective. I needed to get to the armory on level 5 or get out. The creature turned its head sharply toward the lab door. It could smell me, or hear my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed a heavy glass beaker from the desk and hurled it into the far corner of the room. The crash was deafening. The creature shrieked, a sound like grinding gears, and launched itself at the noise with terrifying speed. It didn't run, it skittered, limbs moving in a blur. I bolted. I hit the hallway and sprinted for the stairwell, my boots slamming against the metal. Behind me, the shriek was answered by another, then another. The hive was waking up. I hit the stairwell door, slamming the locking mechanism behind me just as a body collided with the steel. The force of the impact vibrated through the handle. I didn't stop. I slid down the railing, skipping flights of stairs. Level 5. Armory. I burst into the corridor, my lungs burning in the frigid air. The door to the armory was ajar. Bad sign. I swept the room with my weapon light. Racked weapons were missing, ammo crates overturned. Someone had made a last stand here. In the corner, a pile of bodies. Not scientists. Security personnel. They were torn apart, their armor shredded as if by industrial machinery. But amidst the gore I saw it. A prototype case, stamped with a biohazard trefoil. I scrambled over the debris, popping the latches. Inside wasn't a gun. It was a pneumatic injection system and 6 vials of a glowing blue liquid. The label read, Zeta inhibitor/camouflage agent. It masked the thermal signature and pheromones of the living. It was the only way to walk among them. I grabbed the case, slinging it over my shoulder just as the vent above me buckled. Black sludge dripped onto the floor, hissing as it touched the metal. I looked up into the grate and saw a face, skin peeled back to reveal the skull, teeth filed into needlepoints, and those terrible, milky eyes. It grinned, a rictus of malice, and pushed the grate free. I rolled as it landed, the creature moving with the fluidity of mercury. It swiped, claws tearing through my parka, grazing the Kevlar vest underneath. The cold of its presence was shocking, a radiating chill that numbed my skin. I raised the pistol and fired. The round hit its center mass. No blood spray. Just a puff of black dust and a hole that seemed to close as the viscous fluid rushed to fill it. It didn't even flinch. It lunged again. I kicked out, my boot connecting with its knee. There was a sickening crunch, the bone shattered, brittle from the cold, but the creature didn't scream. It just dragged the broken leg, clawing its way up my chest. I jammed the barrel of the gun under its chin and pulled the trigger 3 times. The back of its head blew out in a spray of black ice and brain matter. It went limp, a heavy, freezing weight on top of me. I shoved it off, scrambling to my feet. The hallway was filling with them now. Dozens of shadows detaching from the darkness, their movements jerky and fast. They were evolving, adapting, waiting for fresh meat to thaw them out. I clutched the inhibitor case to my chest and ran for the maintenance shafts. This lab wasn't a cure, it was a breeding ground. And I had just rung the dinner bell. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door was the loudest sound I had heard in 3 weeks. It didn't just break the silence, it murdered it. The screech of metal on frozen rubber echoing down the subterranean corridor like a dinner bell for the dead. I stood motionless in the airlock, my breath pluming in thick, white clouds against the frosted visor of my hazmat suit, waiting for a response from the dark. Nothing came but the stale, recycled air of a tomb that had been sealed since the outbreak began. This was Sector 4 of the Borealis Initiative. A black site facility buried so deep in the Arctic shelf that the satellites probably couldn't even see the heat signature. I wasn't here for answers, though. I was here for calories and caliber. I stepped over the threshold, the magnetic boots of my suit clanking softly on the grated floor. The emergency lighting was running on a dying loop, bathing the hallway in a rhythmic, nausea-inducing pulse of crimson. My Geiger counter remained silent, which was the first piece of good news. I moved to the security station immediately to the left. Scavenging isn't about grabbing everything, it's about grabbing the things that keep you alive for the next 10 minutes. I forced the drawer open with my combat knife. Jackpot. 3 magazines of 5.56mm, standardized NATO issue. Probably cold-soaked but usable. I checked the primer on the top round, clean. I slid them into my chest rig, replacing the empty slots that had been haunting me since the Anchorage evacuation. Further in, the facility opened up into a central atrium. The architecture was sterile, brittlest concrete meeting high-tech composite polymers, now smeared with the dark, frozen residue of a massacre that happened months ago. Bodies were scattered across the floor, but they weren't rotting. That was the first sign that the rules had changed up here. In the temperate zones, the infected bloat and liquefy. Here, the sub-zero environment, combined with whatever the hell they were cooking in the labs, had preserved them. They looked like statues carved from gray meat, their faces locked in varying degrees of agony. I approached one cautiously, keeping the barrel of my carbine trained on its temple. It was wearing a lab coat, the ID badge reading Dr. H. Advanced Virology. I crouched, checking the pockets. A pristine energy bar, frozen solid but edible, and a keycard. As I reached for the card, I noticed the skin on the doctor's hand. It wasn't just frozen, it had calcified. The veins were raised, hard ridges, blue-black and intricate, looking less like biology and more like a crystalline lattice. I moved deeper toward the labs. The objective was the med bay, but the layout forced me through the observation decks. This is where the story of the fall was written in blood and shattered glass. I found a terminal that was still flickering, powered by the facility's geothermal backup. I didn't have time to hack it, but an audio log was queued up on the screen. I hit play. The voice was ragged, breathless. Subject 82 isn't responding to the cryostasis. The pathogen, it's utilizing the ice crystals. It's not hibernating. It's restructuring the host's cellular walls. It's armoring them. The audio cut to static, then a wet tearing sound. I stopped the playback. That explained the bodies in the atrium. The infection hadn't just reanimated them, it had weaponized their biology against the cold. I entered the main viral research wing. The temperature dropped even further here, the facility's climate control failing to combat the encroaching Arctic chill. Rows of containment tubes lined the walls, most shattered, the liquid nitrogen coolant long evaporated. I began rifling through the cabinetry. Syringes, adrenaline injectors, broad-spectrum antibiotics. I swept them all into my pack. These were worth more than gold. Gold couldn't stop septic shock from a jagged piece of rebar. As I closed the bag, a sound scraped against the periphery of my hearing. It was the click of bone on metal. I froze, killing my flashlight. The red emergency strobe washed over the room, offering me a strobe-light glimpse of the threat. At the far end of the lab, near the broken containment unit of Subject 82, something was unfolding itself. It didn't stand up like a man, it uncoiled. The creature was tall, emaciated, its skin translucent and stretched tight over a skeletal structure that had warped. Spikes of bone, or maybe that crystalline ice growth the log mentioned, protruded from its shoulders and spine. It had no eyes, just a pale, smooth surface where the face should be, sensing the room through thermal pits along its jawline. It turned its head, snapping toward my location. My suit was insulated, masking my heat signature, but I had just exerted myself looting the cabinets. I was a glowing ember in a world of ice. I raised my rifle, clicking the safety off. The sound was microscopic, but in the dead silence of the lab, it was a thunderclap. The thing shrieked, a high-pitched, oscillating frequency that vibrated in my teeth, and launched itself across the room. I fired. The muzzle flash blinded me for a microsecond, but I felt the recoil. The rounds hit the creature in the chest, but instead of tearing through soft, rotting flesh, they sparked. The calcified armor plating the doctor had mentioned was bullet-resistant. The creature stumbled but didn't drop. It hit me with the force of a freight train, knocking the wind out of me and sending my rifle skittering across the floor. I scrambled back, my gloves sliding on the frosted tiles. It loomed over me, raising a hand that ended in jagged, obsidian-like claws. I didn't think, I reacted. I pulled a flare from my belt, cracked the cap, and jammed the striking end into the soft tissue of its exposed neck. Right where the armor plating ended. The flare ignited with a blinding magnesium-white light and a roar of burning phosphorus. The creature convulsed, thrashing backward, clawing at the fire eating into its throat. The heat was the weapon. They were adapted for the cold. The extreme heat shock disrupted their nervous system. I rolled to my feet, grabbing my rifle. The creature was flailing, smashing into the lab equipment, screeching in a way that sounded almost mechanical. I didn't wait to see it die. I sprinted for the rear exit, my boots pounding the floor. I burst into the hallway, checking the map on the wall. The armory was down a level, but the noise had surely alerted everything else in the sector. The evolution wasn't just physical armor, it was a hive mind sensitivity to distress. I could hear them now, dozens of clicking, scraping footsteps echoing from the ventilation shafts above and the grating below. I reached a stairwell and vaulted the railing, dropping down to the landing below to save time. The impact jarred my knees, but the adrenaline masked the pain. I needed heavy ordnance. The 5.56mm wasn't enough for these things. I needed AP rounds or incendiaries. I kicked open the door to the armory antechamber. It was locked, mag-sealed. I cursed, fumbling for the keycard I had taken from the frozen doctor. I swiped it. Access denied? Come on, Vance, I muttered, swiping it again. Access denied, biohazard lockdown in effect. The scraping sounds were getting louder. They were in the vents. I looked around the room. There was a manual override lever behind a glass pane. I smashed the glass with the butt of my rifle and yanked the lever. The heavy blast doors groaned, the gears grinding against years of rust and ice, opening agonizingly slowly. A gap appeared, 6 inches, then 12. I squeezed through just as a vent cover in the ceiling blew out. A dark, spidery shape dropped to the floor where I had been standing a second ago. Inside the armory, the air was thick with the smell of gun oil. It was paradise. Racks of experimental weaponry that never saw the front lines. I bypassed the standard assault rifles and went for a heavy case marked XM25 incendiary. I cracked it open. A grenade launcher, bulky and beautiful. I loaded a drum, the mechanical click of the weapon seating the rounds sounding like salvation. I turned back to the door. The gap was still open. The creature from the hallway was trying to squeeze through, its armored shoulders grinding against the metal. It snapped its jaws at me, a rows of needle teeth visible now. I raised the launcher. Evolution has a price, I whispered, and pulled the trigger. The explosion rocked the small room, the blast wave compressing my chest. The creature was blown backward out of the gap, a burning ruin. But the explosion had done something else. It had compromised the structural integrity of the ceiling. Dust and ice rained down. I grabbed a satchel charge from a shelf and a box of high-velocity railgun ammo, something I couldn't use yet but could trade for a king's ransom back. At the settlements, I checked my vitals monitor. Heart rate 160. Oxygen levels dropping. I had scavenged the gear, confirmed the mutation, and survived the first contact. But getting out was going to be the hard part. The facility was waking up. The lights in the armory flickered and died, replaced by the red emergency strobes. Through the thick walls, I heard a deep, resonant thrumming. It wasn't the infected. It was the ventilation fans spinning up. The facility's automated containment protocol had detected the fire. It was going to purge the oxygen. I had 5 minutes to cross 3 sectors of ice-armored super predators before the room became a vacuum. I racked the slide on the grenade launcher and stepped back toward the door. The hunt was on. The wind outside was a physical weight, pressing against my goggles and scouring every inch of exposed gear with razor-sharp ice crystals. But the silence inside the airlock was infinitely heavier. As the hydraulic seal hissed shut behind me, cutting off the shriek of the Arctic storm, the sudden drop in decibels left my ears ringing. I was in. The facility, designated Polaris 9, sat buried beneath 50 feet of permafrost, a forgotten tomb of Cold War paranoia and modern biotech hubris. The air that cycled through the vents tasted metallic, stale, and dangerously thin. I checked my respirator. Filters were at 80%. Good for now. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the debris of a desperate last stand in the security vestibule. Scavenging in this environment required a different mindset. In the cities, you worried about noise and sheer numbers. Here, the cold was the primary antagonist, preserving the dead in a state of suspended animation that blurred the line between corpse and sleeper. I approached the security desk, stepping over the body of a private military contractor. He wasn't rotting. The sub-zero temperatures maintained by the failing life support had turned him into a statue, his skin a translucent blue-gray. Pulled tight against the skull. I knelt, my movements stiff in my thermal suit, and patted him down. No weapon, Someone had already taken that, but his belt pouches were a goldmine. I found 3 sealed auto-injector stims, a high-grade topographic map of the facility, and a keycard with clearance level red. I pocketed them, the sound of Velcro tearing echoing like a gunshot in the dead hall. I pushed deeper, past the heavy blast doors and into the main atrium. The architecture was brutalist and sterile, concrete walls sweating condensation that froze into glittering rivulets. But it was the biological residue that stopped me cold. In the frantic scrawls of survivors I'd found in the lower latitudes, they spoke of the infection burning out in the cold. They were wrong. As I moved toward the research wing, the walls began to change. The industrial gray was overtaken by a creeping, calcified growth, like black coral mixed with bone. It clustered around the vents and light fixtures. I scraped a sample with my combat knife. It was hard as rock but bled a viscous, dark fluid that didn't freeze. The virus hadn't died, it had adapted. It had learned to armor itself against the frost. I entered Lab 4, Cryogenetics. This was where the money was. Or the cure. Or death. The room was lined with vertical glass tanks, most of them shattered, the fluid drained and frozen into slush on the floor. I swept the room with my rifle, the thermal scope washing the room in shades of deep blue and violet. Nothing was generating heat. That was the trap. I moved to the central console, looking for data drives. Scavenging intel was just as vital as food. Knowing what killed these people was the only way to avoid joining them. A log entry was still blinking on a backup terminal. I tapped it. Subject 82 shows remarkable cellular elasticity. The voice on the recording was shaking, clinical detachment failing. The pathogen hyperaccelerates metabolism to generate heat, but in the absence of caloric intake, it initiates a dormancy cycle. It mimics death perfectly until a heat source presents itself. If you are listening to this, do not restore power to the heating grid. My blood ran cold. I glanced at the thermal readouts on the wall. The facility's automated systems were trying to compensate for the storm outside. The ambient temperature was slowly rising. I wasn't just scavenging a tomb. I was walking through a thawing nest. I turned back to the shattered tanks. One was intact. Inside floated a humanoid figure, but it was twisted, evolved. The jaw had unhinged and fused with the clavicle, creating a massive, bone-plated maw. The fingers were elongated into serrated hooks, likely to dig through ice and permafrost. The skin was pure white, lacking pigment, an ambush predator for the snow. I focused on the lockers lining the far wall, needing to be quick. I forced the first one open with a crowbar. Pay dirt. A hazardous material transport case. I cracked it open to find 4 vials of V99 stasis agent. Experimental suppressants. Worth their weight in gold back at the colony. I stashed them in my hardened case, wrapping them in foam. Next locker, a pristine thermal cloak and a box of incendiary shotgun shells. I swapped my standard buckshot immediately. If these things were cold adapted, fire was the only language they would respect. A wet, cracking sound came from behind me. I froze. The sound wasn't the building settling. It was organic. I slowly turned, raising the shotgun. The intact tank was no longer dormant. The creature inside, Subject 82, had opened its eyes. They weren't the milky, cataract-blind eyes of the standard infected. They were jet black, faceted, and focused directly on my heat signature. It didn't thrash, it twitched, testing the limits of its hibernation. Then, it slammed a fist against the reinforced glass. A spiderweb fracture bloomed. I didn't wait. I racked the slide and fired an incendiary round into the center of the glass. The impact shattered the tank, igniting the preservation fluid. The creature spilled out in a wave of fire and chemical slush, screeching a sound that wasn't human. It was the high-pitched shriek of grinding metal. It scrambled to its feet instantly, the fire clinging to its white, armored skin. It didn't stumble. It moved with terrifying, arachnid speed, ignoring the flames that would have disabled a normal zombie. This was the evolution: pain receptors deadened, carapace hardened, muscle density tripled to fight the gravity of heavy snow. It lunged. I sidestepped, the wind of its claws tearing the fabric of my shoulder pad. I pumped another round into its flank. The phosphorus burned through the white armor, exposing pulsating black muscle beneath. It recoiled, hissing, and climbed the wall, digging its claws into the concrete like it was soft clay. It was hunting me, using the verticality of the lab. I backed toward the door, keeping my aim high. It launched itself from the ceiling. I dropped to my back, firing upward. The blast caught it midair, the force knocking it back into the lab benches, scattering microscopes and centrifuges. I scrambled up, heart hammering against my ribs, and sprinted for the hallway. The shriek echoed through the ventilation shafts, answering calls rising from the lower levels. The heat from the fire, the noise of the shotgun. I had rung the dinner bell. The entire facility was waking up. I checked my loot bag. The suppressants were safe. I had what I came for, but the exit was 5 levels up, and the station was crawling with things that saw heat and breathed ice. I reloaded, the click-clack of the shotgun the only promise of safety I had left. The hunt was on, and I was no longer the predator. The hydraulic hiss of the airlock ceiling behind me was the first sound I'd heard in 3 days that wasn't the howling wind or the crunch of my own boots on permafrost. The sudden silence of the interior was heavier than the storm outside. I stood there, shivering violently as the pressurization cycle hummed, watching the frost melt off my goggles in confused, jagged rivulets. The indicator light shifted from a hostile crimson to a sterile green, and the inner blast door groaned open, revealing the throat of the facility. A long, hexagonal corridor bathed in the flickering, dying pulses of emergency amber strobes. My Geiger counter clicked once, a lonely sound, then fell silent. Radiation wasn't the threat here. Isolation was. I gripped the pry bar in my right hand, my knuckles white under the thermal gloves, and stepped into the stale air. It smelled of ozone, recycled oxygen, and something sweeter, the copper tang of old, dried blood. This was Site Omicron. The rumors whispered in the refugee camps back in Dawson City claimed this was where the government had tried to cure it. They were wrong. Governments don't build bunkers under the ice to cure things. They build them to weaponize them, or to hide what they failed to control. Scavenging in the Arctic is a different beast than looting the suburbs. In the cities, you worry about hidden rotters in closets or tripwires set by desperate survivors. Here, the environment is the primary predator. I checked the first room on the left, security checkpoint A. The plexiglass was shattered, the shards scattered across the linoleum like diamonds. A body sat in the chair behind the desk, perfectly preserved by the sub-zero temperatures that had seeped in when the power failed. He was wearing standard-issue tactical gear, the Kevlar vest bulky and untouched. I approached cautiously. No movement. The cold had turned him into a statue. I pried the Glock 17 from his frozen fingers. It took effort. The rigor mortis was reinforced by the freeze. The slide was jammed with frost, useless until thawed, but the ammunition was gold. 2 spare magazines on his belt. I pocketed them. On the desk, a half-drunk cup of coffee had turned into a solid brown puck. Beside it, a manifest. I scanned the lines, shipments of biological sample delta and cryofluid reserve. Standard ominous lab jargon, but the dates were recent. This place had gone dark only 6 months ago, long after the rest of the world had fallen. That meant resources. That meant MREs that hadn't been picked over by rats. I moved deeper. The facility was a labyrinth of brushed steel and frosted glass. I found the mess hall on the 2nd level. It was a tomb. Dozens of staff members sat at tables, slumped over trays of freeze-dried stroganoff. There was no sign of struggle, no bullet holes. They had just stopped. I checked the nearest body. No bite marks. No lacerations. Then I saw the lips. They were blue, naturally, but veined with something black and web-like. I leaned in closer, my headlamp cutting through the gloom. The veins weren't under the skin, they had erupted through the pores, forming a crystalline lattice over the chin and throat. It looked like black frost. I raided the pantry. Jackpot. Cases of heavy-duty Arctic rations, water purification tablets, and thermal blankets. I stuffed my pack until the straps bit into my shoulders. It was almost too easy. Paranoia began to itch at the back of my neck. Why were they all dead without a fight? I grabbed a tablet from a table, hoping the battery had held a charge in the cold. It flickered to life, military-grade hardware. I accessed the last few logs. Chief Virologist Aristown. Log 442. The containment breach in Sector 4 wasn't a failure of the physical barriers. It was an adaptation. The pathogen, it hates the heat now. We thought the Arctic would slow it down, freeze the reanimation process. We were fools. The virus bonded with the cryoprotectants we used on the test subjects. It's not just reanimating dead tissue anymore, it's reinforcing it. It's using the ice. The subjects aren't rotting. They're calcifying. They enter a state of dormancy to preserve energy, mimicking death perfectly until a heat source presents itself. Until the audio cut out with a burst of static. The screen froze on the date. Heat source. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked around the mess hall. My breath puffed out in warm, white clouds. My body heat was radiating outward, a beacon in the absolute zero of the room. The silence wasn't empty, it was waiting. A sound came from the corner of the room, near the vending machines. It wasn't a moan. It was a crack, sharp and loud, like a glacier calving. I spun around, raising the pry bar. The corpse closest to the wall, a woman in a lab coat, twitched. The movement was jerky, mechanical. Another crack. Her neck snapped upright with a horrific grinding noise, the frozen tendons protesting the sudden motion. She didn't look at me with milky, clouded eyes like the ones back south. Her eyes were gone, replaced by solid black ice that had filled the sockets. The black lattice on her skin pulsed. She stood up, not shambling, but unfolding like a jagged, broken puppet. Heat. The word didn't come from a throat, it was a vibration of the ice in her chest. I backed away, knocking a tray off a table. The clatter was deafening. Every head in the room turned. The sound of cracking joints filled the air, a symphony of breaking ice. They were waking up. The scientist lunged. She covered the distance with terrifying speed, her movements lacking the fluid grace of the living but possessing the unstoppable momentum of an avalanche. I swung the pry bar, aiming for the temple. It connected with a shock that jarred my arm to the shoulder. It didn't squelch, it crunched. The metal bar bent slightly. Her skull didn't cave in. A chunk of it chipped off like porcelain, revealing not gray matter, but a frozen, crystallized sludge. She didn't even flinch. She grabbed my jacket. Her grip was like a vice, the cold radiating from her fingers burning through the layers of my clothing instantly. She opened her mouth, and I saw rows of teeth sharpened by breakage, coated in black ichor. I kicked her in the chest, my boot finding purchase on the frozen gore of her lab coat. It was like kicking a concrete wall. I lost my balance, falling backward over a bench. She was on me instantly, her weight immense. The infection had made her dense, heavy. The air around her was so cold it stung my eyes. I jammed the pry bar under her chin, holding her snapping jaws inches from my face. The black frost on her skin was spreading, reaching out toward the warmth of my hands. This wasn't just reanimation. This was evolution. The virus had weaponized the environment. They were armored by the very cold that was supposed to kill them. I scrambled back, abandoning the pry bar to draw the knife from my boot. Conventional blunt force wouldn't work. I needed to sever the spine. I rolled to the side as she smashed her fist into the floor where my head had been, shattering the linoleum tile. I scrambled to my feet, sprinting for the door. Behind me, the mess hall was a chorus of scraping chairs and snapping bones. I burst into the hallway, sliding on the slick floor. I needed a bottleneck. I needed fire. I fumbled for the flare gun I'd looted from a pilot's corpse weeks ago. One shell. The scientist rounded the corner, followed by 3 soldiers in tactical gear. The soldiers were worse. Their armor was fused to their bodies by the ice, making them walking tanks. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized purpose, drawn to my thermal signature. I raised the flare gun. The hallway was narrow. "Eat this," I whispered, my voice trembling. I pulled the trigger. The magnesium flare erupted with a blinding red light and a roar of heat. It struck the lead scientist in the chest. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for them. The sudden, extreme thermal shock didn't burn them, it shattered them. The rapid expansion of the frozen fluids in their bodies against the intense heat caused the scientist's chest to explode outward in a spray of razor-sharp ice shards and black sludge. She collapsed, her structural integrity failing. The others flinched, reeling back from the wave of heat, their movements becoming sluggish and uncoordinated as the temperature spiked. It was their weakness. They were specialized for the cold. Heat disrupted the lattice. I didn't wait to see if they recovered. I turned and ran toward the elevator shafts, the red glare of the burning flare casting long, dancing shadows against the steel walls. I had scavenged food, yes, but I had found something far more important, the knowledge of what the world was becoming. The infection wasn't just surviving, it was learning. And down here, in the dark and the cold, it had built an army that couldn't be killed, only shattered. I reached the elevator, prying the doors open to reveal the empty shaft. The cables hung loose, descending into the pitch black of the lower levels, the research labs. That's where the answers were. That's where the heat source would be. I clipped my carabiner to the cable and looked down. The darkness seemed to breathe, a cold draft rising up to meet me, carrying the scent of black ice and ancient death. I had to go deeper. The hydraulic hiss of the airlock cycling down was the loudest sound I'd heard in 3 months. It wasn't the groaning, mechanical grind of the blast doors back at the Cheyenne bunker, nor the wet, slapping sound of the dead wandering the slush of the lower latitudes. It was a sterile, pressurized sigh that signaled the boundary between the howling white void of the Arctic tundra and the tomb of the Apex facility. The heavy steel door rolled back, revealing a corridor bathed in the flickering, dying pulses of emergency amber lighting. My breath bloomed in dense clouds before my face mask, the condensation instantly freezing against the polycarbonate visor. It was colder inside than it was out there. That was the first warning, though I was too busy checking the Geiger counter to heed it. Radiation levels were negligible. That meant the containment failure wasn't nuclear. It was biological. I gripped the grip of my suppressed carbine, the metal biting through my gloves, and stepped into the vestibule. The silence here was heavy, oppressive. It felt like walking into the throat of a sleeping leviathan. My objective was simple: scavenge. Food, fuel, medical supplies, and data. The rumors whispered over shortwave radio frequencies before the static took over claimed this place had achieved sustainability before the world went dark. If that were true, there would be hydroponics. There would be seeds. Moving deeper into Sector A, administration and logistics, I scanned the floor. No bodies. Not yet. Just scattered papers, overturned chairs, and a thick layer of frost coating every surface. It looked less like a massacre and more like an evacuation that happened mid-sentence. I pried open a supply closet, the metal snapping like brittle candy in the extreme cold. Inside I struck gold, or the apocalypse equivalent. A crate of thermal batteries, military grade, and a shelf of MREs that hadn't been picked over by rats or looters. I shoved the batteries into my pack, the weight comforting. As I reached for the MREs, I saw it, a smear on the wall behind the shelf. It was black, viscous, and frozen solid. It wasn't blood. It looked like oil, or tar, branching out in fractal patterns like frost on a windowpane. I scraped a sample with my knife. It didn't chip, it flaked off in geometric shards. I pushed on toward the biolabs in Sector C, navigating through the gloom. The air grew colder, sharp enough to sting my eyes even through the mask. The architecture changed here. Reinforced glass, decontamination showers, heavy bulkheads. I found a terminal that still had a flicker of power, hooked up to a localized backup grid. I hacked the login, standard military encryption, lazy for a black site, and pulled up the last research logs. The date was 6 months after the initial outbreak. Subject 84 Delta, the log read. Adaptation to cryostasis is concerning. The pathogen isn't dormant. It's rewriting the host's cellular structure. Antifreeze proteins typically found in Arctic flounder are being synthesized at a rate that defies thermodynamics. The host body isn't decaying. It's hardening. I scrolled down, my heart hammering against my ribs. The necrotic tissue is being replaced by a crystalline lattice. It's not just preserving them, it's armoring them. They don't need oxygen. They don't need sustenance. They just wait for heat. Heat. I froze. My tactical light was an LED, running cold, but my body heat. Inside this thermal suit, I was a walking furnace in a freezer. I slowly turned my head from the screen to the observation window overlooking the main containment floor below. Below me, in the shadows of the vat room, they stood. Hundreds of them. They weren't shambling. They weren't twitching. They were statues of pale blue and gray, standing in perfect, eerie stillness. The rot I was used to, the sagging flesh, the exposed bone, the smell of sulfur and death, was absent. These things were pristine, preserved in the absolute zero of the lab. Their skin looked like marble, veined with that black, fractal tar I'd seen earlier. They were naked, stripped of humanity, but they hadn't succumbed to the elements. They had become the elements. I needed to get to the dispensary on the far side of the containment floor. That's where the high-grade antibiotics and epinephrine would be. I moved to the stairwell, every step a calculated risk. The metal grating of the stairs had been rubberized to dampen sound. But the silence was so absolute that the friction of my gear sounded like thunder. I reached the floor level. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees. I could feel the cold seeping through the joints of my suit. I navigated through the maze of dormant figures. Up close, the evolution of the infection was terrifyingly clear. The fingers hadn't rotted away, they had fused and elongated into jagged, bone-like spikes. The eyes were gone, covered over by a translucent film of that crystalline substance, likely to protect the brain from freezing. They were blind, but the logs said they sensed heat. I kept my breathing shallow, trying to minimize the venting of warm air from my mask. I reached the dispensary door. Locked. Maglock. I needed to bypass it. I pulled out my decryption tool, the small screen glowing a soft blue. I plugged it into the panel. The moment the current hit the lock, a spark jumped. A tiny, insignificant pop of electricity. Behind me, a sound. Like ice cracking on a frozen lake. I turned slowly. The nearest statue, a 7-foot-tall figure that might have once been a security guard, shifted. The movement was rigid, snapping. The frost coating its shoulders shattered as it turned its head toward the spark. It didn't groan. It emitted a high-frequency chittering sound, like crickets in a summer field, but distorted and metallic. Thermal sensors. They were echolocating via heat signatures. The chittering spread. One by one, the statues shifted, heads snapping toward me. The black veins under their marble skin began to pulse, glowing with a faint, bioluminescent violet hue. They were powering up. The maglock disengaged with a clunk. I threw the door open, grabbed the duffel bag I'd prepped, and started sweeping shelves. Painkillers, broad-spectrum antibiotics, surgical kits. I didn't look at labels, I just grabbed. From the doorway, a shadow fell over me. The security guard variant lunged. It didn't stumble. It launched itself with hydraulic force. I raised the carbine and fired. Asterisk pwip pwip pwip. Asterisk. The round struck the creature's chest. No blood spray. Just sparks and the sound of bullets ricocheting off stone. The crystalline lattice. The logs were right. They were armored. The impact staggered it, pushing it back a step, but it didn't drop. It roared, a sound devoid of vocal cords, just the rushing of air through a modified larynx, cold and sharp. I aimed for the joints, the knees, the neck, where the armor had to be thinner to allow movement. I put a round through its knee. The limb shattered, spraying shards of frozen black ichor. The creature collapsed, but it didn't stop. It began to crawl, digging its spiked fingers into the linoleum floor, dragging its broken body toward my heat. More were coming. The chittering was deafening now, a cacophony of insected clicking rising from hundreds of throats. They were fast. Much faster than the city walkers. The cold didn't slow them down, it was their conductor. I tossed a flare, standard red phosphorus, into the center of the room. It ignited with a blinding brilliance and searing heat. The effect was immediate and chaotic. The hive mind broke. Every single one of them diverted their attention to the flare, swarming it, clawing at the burning light, confusing the intense heat source for prey. It was a frenzy of snapping limbs and shattering ice. I sprinted. I didn't check my 6. I ran for the stairwell, my lungs burning, the weight of the scavenged gear threatening to drag me down. I hit the stairs, taking them two at a time. Below me, the flare sputtered and died. The screaming stopped. Silence returned. Then, the heavy, rhythmic thudding of footsteps chasing me up the metal stairs. Not the shuffle of the dead. The sprint of the predator. I burst through the airlock vestibule, slamming the inner bulkhead button. The heavy door began to slide shut. A hand, pale, crystalline, and tipped with obsidian claws, shot through the gap. It gripped the steel doorframe, bending the metal. The strength was impossible. I raised the carbine, placed the muzzle against the exposed forearm, and pulled the trigger. The limb shattered. The arm fell to the floor inside the vestibule, twitching, the fingers still trying to grasp something warm. The door sealed. I stood there in the dark, listening to the frantic scratching on the other side. It sounded like hail on a tin roof, a million tiny impacts trying to drill through the steel. I looked down at the severed arm on the floor. It wasn't dead. The black veins were still pulsing, and the fingers were inching across the floor, dragging the stump toward my boot. I stomped on it, shattering the structure into dust and ice. I cycled the outer airlock and stumbled back out into the Arctic wind. The whiteout was blinding, but it felt like a warm embrace compared to the stillness of that lab. I had the meds. I had the data. But I also had the knowledge. The infection wasn't just surviving the winter. It was weaponizing it. And spring was a long, long way off. The hydraulic hiss of the airlock ceiling behind me severed the connection to the howling white void of the tundra. For a moment, the silence was deafening, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. Broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the circulation fans running on emergency power. I lowered my scarf, the ice crusting the wool melting instantly against my skin in the relative warmth of the antechamber. It was still freezing, breath pluming in thick gray clouds, but it wasn't the killing cold of the outside. This place, the Site Omicron Research Facility, had been a ghost story among the survivors in Anchorage. A whisper of salvation or damnation buried under the ice cap. Now, standing in the flickering amber light of the decontamination zone, it felt more like a gut. I was inside the beast. My boots, wrapped in layers of rag and duct tape, crunched softly on the metal grating as I moved deeper. Scavenging was a discipline of details, and the first detail I noticed was the lack of bodies. Usually, military checkpoints are choke points, piles of brass casings, blood splatter, the gnawed remains of the panicked. Here, the floor was pristine, save for a layer of dust undisturbed for years. That scared me more than the gore would have. It implied order. It implied that whatever happened here didn't happen with a chaotic breakout. It happened with a lockdown. I checked the magazine of my MP5. 12 rounds. I had a machete on my hip and a desperate need for calories. My stomach cramped, a hollow reminder that I hadn't eaten in 2 days. The priority was the mess hall, then the armory, then the data center. In that order. I bypassed the security kiosk, sliding a knife through the gap in the plexiglass to jimmy the lock. Inside, the guard's chair was overturned. On the desk sat a mug of coffee, the liquid inside evaporated to a black, tar-like sludge. I rifled through the drawers. Jackpot. A box of flare rounds, a tactical flashlight with lithium batteries, and a half-eaten protein bar that was rock-hard but sealed. I gnawed on the bar as I moved, the chemical taste of chocolate and preservatives flooding my mouth with dopamine. It wasn't enough, but it cleared the fog in my brain. I swapped the batteries in my light, the beam cutting a crisp, white cone through the gloom of the corridor labeled cryogenetics. As I descended to level 2, the temperature dropped. The walls here were lined with frost, thick jagged patterns that looked less like ice and more like organic growth. I stopped at a smashed viewport looking into a lab. The glass was 3 inches thick, bulletproof, yet something had started from the inside with tremendous force. I shone my light into the room. It was a slaughterhouse frozen in time. Scientists in white coats lay scattered, but not in the way I was used to. They weren't eaten. They were broken. Limbs snapped at impossible angles, chests caved in. And they were covered. A translucent, bluish resin coated the bodies, anchoring them to the floor and walls. I stepped closer, wiping frost from the glass. The resin wasn't ice. It was biological. I found a terminal that still had a faint glow. I hacked the keypad, generic admin password, typical military arrogance, and the screen flickered to life. The log was dated 3 years ago. Subject 88 Beta exhibits extreme adaptation to sub-zero environments. The pathogen has ceased necrotic decay and initiated cellular crystallization. Note: the infected do not freeze. Their blood acts as a hyper-efficient antifreeze. Metabolism slows to near stasis until prey proximity is detected. They are not dead. They are waiting. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature sprinted down my spine. I looked back through the glass. One of the resin-encased bodies was missing an arm. No, not missing. The resin had cracked open. It was empty. A cocoon. I racked the bolt of the MP5, the metallic clack echoing too loudly in the corridor. I needed a weapon with more stopping power. If these things had crystallized skin, 9mm rounds would just piss them off. I moved faster, abandoning stealth for speed. The armory was 2 sectors over. I passed a row of containment cells, the heavy steel doors buckled outward. Deep gouges marred the metal, 3 distinct claw marks, tearing through steel like wet cardboard. The evolution of the virus here hadn't just made them durable, it had turned them into apex predators. The shamblers in the cities were rotting bags of meat. These things were honed weapons. I reached the armory door. Locked. Maglock engaged. I swore under my breath and knelt to hotwire the panel, my fingers stiff and clumsy. A sound drifted down the hall behind me. It wasn't a moan. It was a clicking sound, like ice cracking in a glass of water. Asterisk click. Click. Hiss. Asterisk I spun around, raising the light. The corridor was empty. The clicking stopped. I turned back to the wires, twisting the red and blue together. A spark, a groan of dying electronics, and the maglock disengaged. I shoulder-checked the door open and stumbled inside. The armory was a scavenger's wet dream. Racks of assault rifles, shotguns, and tactical gear. But I ignored the rifles. I went straight for the heavy ordnance. I grabbed a Benelli M4 shotgun, slinging a bandolier of slugs over my shoulder. Slugs would punch through the crystallization. I also found a thermal optic. I snapped it onto the rail of the shotgun and activated it. The room turned into a wash of cool blues and greens. Then I saw the heat signature. It wasn't in the hallway. It was on the ceiling, directly above the door I had just entered. A glowing red and orange shape, crouched like a spider. I looked up with my naked eyes. Nothing but shadows and pipes. I looked through the thermal again. It was there, blending perfectly with the frost-covered ductwork, its skin camouflaged by the cold. Its core heat masked by some biological insulation. Only the thermal optic picked up the leakage from its eyes and mouth. It dropped before I could raise the barrel. The creature hit me with the force of a falling anvil, pinning me to the floor. The MP5 skittered away. I stared up into a face that was no longer human. The skin was pale, almost transparent, revealing a network of blue, pulsing veins beneath. Its eyes were gone, replaced by multifaceted crystals that refracted the light of my fallen flashlight. It opened its mouth, unhinging its jaw, and I saw rows of serrated, needle-like teeth made of the same bone-white crystal. It didn't smell like rot, it smelled like ozone and crushed mint. It shrieked, a high-pitched frequency that blurred my vision, and drove a clawed hand down at my throat. I brought the stock of the shotgun up, blocking the strike. The impact jarred my teeth, the creature's strength unnatural, hydraulic. The claw gouged into the polymer stock. It was heavy, denser than any zombie I'd fought. The crystallization added mass. I kicked upward, driving my boot into its midsection. It felt like kicking a concrete wall. I roared, adrenaline flooding my system, and twisted my body, throwing the creature off balance. It skittered back, moving on all fours with jerky, insected speed. It leaped to the wall, clinging to the vertical surface with its claws, cocking its head. It was studying me. Learning. The infection here had granted them intelligence, or at least a predatory cunning. I raised the shotgun. The thermal scope showed its heart, a burning ember in the center of its chest. It lunged. I pulled the trigger. The roar of the shotgun was deafening in the confined space. The slug hit it midair. It didn't splatter. It shattered. Chunks of crystal and frozen flesh exploded outward. The creature slammed into the lockers, twitching. Blue blood, thick and viscous, pooled on the floor, steaming in the cold air. I pumped the action, ejecting the spent shell, and put another round into its head for good measure. The skull disintegrated into icy shards. I stood there, panting, my breath ragged. I looked at the carcass. The evolution was terrifying. The virus had repurposed the host completely, turning bone to crystal and skin to armor. I realized then that the silence of the lab wasn't due to a lockdown. It was because the ecosystem here had stabilized. These things had eaten everything else. I quickly looted a tactical vest, stuffing it with as many shotgun shells as I could carry. I found a survival knife with a serrated edge and a medkit containing strictly controlled stimulants. I injected a stimulant directly into my thigh. The fatigue vanished, replaced by a jittery, hyper-focused clarity. I had to keep moving. The gunshot would have alerted the others. The hive mind theory from the log, if they were dormant until prey was detected, I had just rung the dinner bell. I exited the armory, sweeping the corridor with the thermal scope. The hallway, previously empty, was now lighting up. Dozens of heat signatures were waking up in the walls, in the ceiling vents, under the floor grates. The facility was coming alive. I wasn't the scavenger anymore. I was the foreign contaminant, and the immune system of Site Omicron was waking up to purge me. I turned toward the data center, running. I needed the research. If there was a cure, or even a weakness, it was on those drives. And if I didn't make it out, I'd make damn sure this place was buried under the ice forever. I pulled a grenade from a crate by the door, pulled the pin, and rigged it to the door handle behind me. I sprinted into the dark, the sound of 100 clicking throats rising in a chorus behind me. The hiss of the hydraulic seal breaking was the loudest sound in the world. It cut through the howling Arctic wind outside, a sharp, mechanical gasp of equalization that signaled the breach of the facility's outer airlock. I pushed the heavy titanium door inward, the hinges screaming against decades of accumulated ice. My breath plumed inside my face shield, instantly fogging the polycarbonate before the suit's circulation fans kicked into high gear to clear it. I stepped inside, the metal grating of the floor crunching under my boots. The silence that followed the closing of the door was heavy, pressurized, and smelled of ozone and stale, frozen death. This was the Valhalla Directive's primary research site, designated Polaris. According to the fragments of data I'd pulled from a dying satellite uplink in Saskatchewan, this was where the virus didn't just start, it was where it was engineered. I wasn't looking for a cure. That hope had died 3 years ago along with the rest of the southern hemisphere. I was looking for the one thing the Arctic preserved better than anything else: untapped resources. My Geiger counter clicked rhythmically, a slow, steady heartbeat indicating low-level background radiation. Likely from the facility's geothermal containment field, but nothing lethal. I engaged the tactical light on my carbine, the beam cutting through the gloom of the entry atrium. The reception area was a mausoleum of frozen despair. Bodies were scattered everywhere, not torn apart in the chaotic violence typical of the urban outbreaks, but slumped in chairs or curled into fetal balls on the floor. They were preserved perfectly by the sub-zero ambient temperature. I approached a corpse draped over the security desk. The nameplate read Corporal Holloway. His skin was a translucent blue-gray, hard as granite. There were no bite marks. I checked his sidearm, a Sig Sauer P320. I racked the slide. Frozen solid. Useless without a heat gun and lubricant. But the magazines. I stripped the vest, pulling 3 full mags of 9mm hollow points. I pocketed them. Scavenging in the deep freeze meant looking for chemical stability. Gunpowder kept dry was good forever. Batteries were a gamble. Rations were gold. I moved deeper, bypassing the elevators which were sealed shut by emergency protocols, and took the stairwell down to level 3. Biocontainment and logistics. The air grew colder the deeper I went, the temperature dropping to something that would kill an exposed man in minutes. My suit's heater was running at 80% capacity. I had maybe 4 hours before my power cells drained. I needed to find the facility's armory or the medical stores immediately. Level 3 was a labyrinth of shattered glass and overturned gurneys. Here, the violence had occurred. Blood spatters on the walls were frozen into abstract rubies, crystallized in mid-spray. I stepped over a lab coat torn in half. The ID badge lay face up, Dr. Eris Thorne Virology. I crouched, checking the pockets. A ruggedized tablet. I pressed the power button. Nothing. I plugged it into my suit's external power coupling. The screen flickered to life, the battery icon flashing red. I accessed the logs while keeping my rifle trained down the hallway. The last entry was dated 2 years ago. Subject 89 is displaying unique adaptation to the cryostasis protocols. Thorne's voice was tinny, distorted by the recording. The pathogen, strain epsilon, reacts to the cold not by dormancy, but by fortification. It's replacing the water in the host cells with a biological antifreeze, a glucose-rich sludge that prevents ice crystal formation in the brain, but allows the dermis to freeze solid. They aren't dying. They're becoming armored. God help us, we made them bulletproof. I disconnected the tablet. Armored. That wasn't in the briefing. I swept the light across the hall. The shadows stretched long and thin. I needed to move. I found the logistics office, the door unlocked. Inside was a scavenger's paradise. Crates of MREs, the cold weather variety with extra caloric density. I loaded as many as I could into my ruck, tossing out the useless weight of my sleeping bag. I wouldn't be sleeping here. I found a box of CR-123 batteries, lithium-based, resistant to the cold. I swapped out my flashlight and optic power sources immediately. Then I heard it. Not a groan. The infected down south groaned because their vocal cords were rotting. This was a sound like tectonic plates grinding together, a high-pitched, crystalline shriek of friction. It came from the ventilation duct above me. I rolled forward just as the grate exploded downward. The creature that landed on the logistics desk was a nightmare of evolution. It was humanoid, but gaunt, its skin pulled tight against bone and turned a deep, bruised purple. But it was the armor that stopped my breath. Patches of thick, white frost covered its shoulders, chest, and skull, looking like organic plate mail. It turned its head toward me, the movement jerky, mechanical. Its eyes were gone, covered by a layer of white cataracts, but it snapped its jaws, teeth replaced by jagged shards of bone. I fired. The .556 round hit the creature's center mass. A spark showered off its chest. The bullet didn't penetrate. It ricocheted off the frozen, hardened dermis. The kinetic impact barely staggered it. It lunged, faster than any shambler I'd ever fought. It was a predator, fueled by the hypermetabolism the cold required. I scrambled back, knocking over a shelf of sterile bandages. The creature swiped, its hand a claw of frozen flesh rigid enough to tear through Kevlar. It caught my shoulder, ripping the outer layer of my suit. The cold air rushed in like a knife. Warning alarms blared in my helmet. Suit integrity compromised. I kicked at its knee, the only joint that looked exposed. It shattered with the sound of a pistol crack. The thing shrieked again, falling to one side, but it didn't stop. It began to crawl, dragging its broken leg, the bone protruding but not bleeding. The sludge inside was too thick to flow. I needed heat. I fumbled for the flare pouch on my belt. I ripped the cap off a magnesium road flare and struck the igniter. The room washed in blinding red light. The creature recoiled, screeching as the heat hit it. The thermal shock was its weakness. The rapid temperature change caused the frozen armor to crack. I didn't hesitate. I jammed the burning flare into the open wound of its knee and kicked it away. It thrashed, the heat burrowing into the chemical slurry of its bloodstream. While it convulsed, I switched to my secondary, a sawed-off 12-gauge loaded with slugs. I aimed for the head, right where the flare's heat was causing the facial frost to sublimate into steam. I pulled the trigger. The boom was deafening in the small room. The slug didn't ricochet this time. It punched through the softened skull, blowing the back of the creature's head out in a spray of black, gelatinous fluid. I stood panting, the adrenaline shaking my hands. My suit was screaming about the hull breach. I grabbed a roll of industrial duct tape from the shelf, scavenged gold, and slapped a patch over the tear in my shoulder. It wouldn't hold forever, but it stopped the immediate freezing of my skin. I looked at the corpse. This was the evolution. The virus had integrated with the environment. It wasn't just biological warfare anymore. It was elemental. I reloaded the shotgun, my fingers numb. The noise would have attracted others. I could hear them now, distant clicks and grinds echoing through the facility's pipes. They were waking up. I grabbed a final box of medical injectors, broad-spectrum adrenaline and morphine, and moved to the door. I hadn't found the main server room yet. That's where the data was. That's where the origin point was. And if Dr. Thorne's logs were right, that's where the queen, or whatever controlled this hive of frozen horrors, would be waiting. I checked my ammo count. 2 magazines. 4 shells. 1 flare. Time to go to work, I whispered, and stepped back into the frozen dark. The hydraulic seal of the blast door hissed, a sound like a dying breath that had been held for a decade. My breath plumed before me, freezing instantly against the faceplate of my thermal mask. The Arctic wind outside was a screaming banshee, clawing at the reinforced concrete of the bunker, but inside, the silence was heavier. It pressed against my eardrums with a physical weight, a vacuum of sound that felt unnatural. I stepped into the decontamination chamber, the magnetic lock of the outer door clanging shut behind me, sealing me in with whatever ghosts haunted the Borealis research station. The lights were dead, naturally. I clicked on my tactical lumen, the beam cutting through the suspended dust motes. No, not dust. Ice crystals. The air inside was colder than the tundra outside, a sterile, absolute zero that seeped through the layers of my envirosuit. I moved systematically, the scavenger's instinct overriding the primal fear of the dark. The decontamination zone was clear, save for a few discarded hazmat suits that lay crumpled on the floor like shed skins. I checked the pockets of the nearest one. Empty. No ID, no keys. Just a lingering smell of antiseptic and fear. I pushed through the secondary doors into the central hub. This must have been the security checkpoint. 2 bodies sat behind the ballistic glass of the reception desk. They weren't slumped over. They were rigid, sitting upright in their chairs, covered in a thin sheen of frost. I approached the glass, wiping away a layer of rime with my gloved hand. Their skin was blue, bordering on black, but it hadn't decomposed. The cold had preserved them perfectly, freezing the moment of their death in high definition. Their eyes were open, clouded with white cataracts of ice, staring blankly at the monitors that had gone dark years ago. I bypassed the lock with a pry bar, the metal screeching in the silence, sending shivers down my spine. I needed supplies before I could worry about the dead. I vaulted the desk and crouched beside the bodies. The guard on the left had a sidearm, a standard issue P226. I checked the mag full. The slide was frozen shut, but a little kinetic persuasion against the desk edge loosened it. I pocketed the weapon and 2 spare magazines found on his belt. But the real prize was the keycard dangling from a lanyard around his neck. Level 4 clearance. That meant access to the lower labs, the mess hall, and the armory. I snagged it, my fingers brushing against the guard's neck. It was hard as stone, but I felt something underneath the skin, a texture like gravel. Not smooth muscle, but something crystalline. Moving past the checkpoint, I found the mess hall. This was the holy grail for a scavenger. The shelves in the dry storage pantry were decimated, likely raided by the staff in the early days of the outbreak. But they had missed the things that required effort. I found a crate of MREs shoved behind a stack of empty flour sacks. Menu 18, beef ravioli. I nearly wept. I shoved 4 of the brown packets into my pack, the weight reassuring against my spine. I checked the walk-in freezer. The door was ajar, the mechanism broken. Inside, sides of beef hung from hooks, frozen solid. But they were wrong. The meat wasn't red. It was a dark, bruised purple, and weird, translucent spikes protruded from the muscle fibers. I stepped closer, shining my light on a hanging ribcage. The bone hadn't just broken, it had bloomed. Sharp, fractal growths of osseous matter spiraled out from the ribs, piercing the meat. It looked like the bone was trying to escape the flesh. I backed away, leaving the meat untouched. The infection here. It wasn't just reanimating dead tissue. It was terraforming it. I left the mess hall and headed for the elevators. The shafts were dead, obviously, so I took the stairs, descending into the bowels of the facility. Level B2, Virology. The air grew colder here, the frost on the walls thickening into jagged ridges. I found a hallway lined with lockers. I popped one open. Inside, a lab coat, a picture of a dog, and a data pad. I tried to power it on. Nothing. I swapped the battery with a spare from my kit. Universal connectors were a blessing of the modern military. The screen flickered to life, the eerie blue glow illuminating the dark hallway. I scrolled through the logs. The last entry was dated 3 years ago. Subject 0 isn't responding to the antivirals. The text read. The pathogen has mutated. We thought the cold would slow it down, induce dormancy. We were wrong. The virus is cryophilic. It thrives in the sub-zero. It's metabolizing the ice, replacing the water in the host cells with a biological antifreeze. It's hardening them. They aren't rotting, they're calcifying. They are becoming something else. Something distinct. We are sealing the sector. God help us. I pocketed the data pad. Cryophilic. That explained the bodies upstairs. The standard shamblers I'd fought on the surface were slow, clumsy, rotting bags of meat. These things, they were preserved. Strengthened. I reached the bottom of the stairwell. The door to the main lab was torn off its hinges, lying dented on the floor. The metal was rent as if by giant claws. I raised my rifle, flicking the safety off. The beam of my light swept across the room. Shattered glass everywhere. Overturned tables. And in the center, rows of containment tubes. Most were broken, jagged teeth of glass pointing upward. But the fluids on the floor weren't liquid. They were frozen slicks of black ichor. I stepped carefully, the crunch of glass under my boots sounding like gunshots. I needed to find the sample storage. If there was a cure, or at least data on the origin, it would be in the deep freeze vault. I saw the vault door ahead, a massive circular portal of titanium. It was closed. I swiped the keycard. The reader beeped, a miraculous, chirping sound, and the tumblers groaned. The door hissed open, revealing a rush of vapor. I stepped inside. The room was lined with drawers. I began pulling them open. Vials of blood. Tissue samples. And then, a weapon case. Not a gun, but a pneumatic injection system. Labeled experimental antigen. I grabbed it. Then I heard it. A clicking sound. Like two stones being struck together underwater. It came from the ceiling. I froze, slowly tilting my head up, raising the light. Clinging to the ventilation pipes, 20 feet above, was a figure. It was humanoid, but elongated. Its limbs were stretched, the joints swollen and encased in white, bony armor. Its skin was pale blue, almost translucent, pulled tight over a skeleton that had grown too large for its body. It had no eyes, just a smooth, pale dome where the forehead should be. Its mouth was a vertical slit, filled with needle-like teeth that glistened in the light. It didn't moan. It didn't shuffle. It watched me with senses I couldn't comprehend. Then it dropped. It landed silently, absorbing the impact with a sickening grace, its knees bending backward like a bird's. I fired. The muzzle flash blinded me for a microsecond. The 5.56mm rounds hit the creature's chest, but instead of the wet thud of hitting flesh, There was a sound like cracking ceramic. Chips of white bone armor flew off. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched frequency that vibrated in my teeth, and lunged. It was fast. Blindingly fast. I rolled to the left, feeling the wind of its claws slice the air where my neck had been. These weren't fingernails. They were 3-inch spikes of calcified bone. I scrambled back, firing wildly. One round caught its shoulder, shattering the frozen armor and spraying black ichor that hissed when it hit the floor. It was vulnerable to kinetic impact, brittle, like ice, but its speed was overwhelming. It leaped onto a lab table, digging its claws into the steel to anchor itself, and coiled for another strike. I saw the muscles bunching under the translucent skin, fibrous, gray cables of tension. I didn't have enough ammo to chip away at its armor. I needed high impact. I glanced around. A rack of compressed nitrogen tanks stood by the wall near the door. The creature sprang. I threw myself flat, sliding across the frozen sludge on the floor. The creature overshot, slamming into the wall with a force that shook the room. I raised my rifle and fired, not at the monster, but at the valve of the nitrogen tank. The brass fitting sparked, then sheared off. The tank exploded. It wasn't a fireball, it was a concussion of pressure. The tank became a missile, spinning wildly. It slammed into the creature's midsection with the force of a freight train. The sound was horrific, the crunch of the creature's brittle, evolved skeleton shattering under the blunt force. It was pinned against the far wall, the escaping gas freezing the air instantly, creating a wide-out fog. I didn't wait to see if it was dead. I grabbed the case with the antigen and sprinted for the door. Behind me, through the hissing gas, I heard a gurgling, clicking screech. It was hurt, crippled maybe, but not dead. I hit the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time, my lungs burning in the freezing air. I could hear other sounds now, echoes from the ventilation shafts. The explosion had woken the hive. The clicking was multiplying, a chorus of cracking ice echoing through the facility. They were coming out of the walls. I burst into the lobby, vaulting the reception desk again. The 2 frozen guards were gone. My heart hammered against my ribs. I didn't look for them. I sprinted for the airlock, slamming the button. The inner door cycled agonizingly slow. I spun around, rifle raised. Shadows were moving in the hallway I had just exited. Jerky, angular movements. Not the shuffle of the dead, but the stalking of predators. The inner door sealed. The decontamination cycle began. I screamed at it to hurry. Finally, the outer door hissed open. The wind hit me, violent and cold, but it felt like freedom. I stumbled out into the snow, the blast door sealing the nightmare back inside. I had the data. I had the samples. But as I looked back at the concrete slab of the entrance, buried in the drift, I knew the Arctic wasn't a grave for the virus. It was a cocoon,